Betters, and for my video essay, I am going to be talking about the film called On the Basis of Sex. And this is a 2018 biographic legal drama film, and it's based on the life and the cases that was represented by Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So how this film starts out is that Ruth is a first-year student at Harvard Law School. Her husband, Martin, is a second-year student at Harvard. And while they're there, their first year together at Harvard Law School, they're having a good night with friends, and then out of nowhere he falls ill, and then they find out at the hospital that he's actually been diagnosed with testicular cancer. And at the time it was considered a rare form, which obviously, seeing as it is 2019 now, it's not so much seen as a rare form anymore, since it's so common and since it seems like we know a little bit more about it than what we did back in the 1950s to early 60s. But while she's taking care of him, and they also have a daughter, a baby named Jane, she's also going to his classes and her own, as well as taking his notes, transcribing his lectures, everything just to help him succeed and to graduate on time, which is commendable. And not long after that, her husband ends up getting his cancer is finally in remission 2 years later, and he graduates from Harvard Law School, and he gets hired by a firm in New York. And Ruth decides that since they are going to be moving to New York, she wants to talk to the dean, his name is Erwin Griswold, to see if she can finish her degree from Harvard through classes at Columbia Law School. And unfortunately, it looked like the dean had denied her request because he was insisting that he was following the policies at that time, which and then he ends up reprimanding her for it, saying that you will do well to remember that this is a privilege. But despite the fact that she obviously got her request denied, she eventually transferred to Columbia Law School, and from there she finished her degree, and she actually graduated at the top of her class, which according to the research that I did find, it was actually a tie for first place as being top person in the class. And even though, despite the fact that she did graduate at the top of her class, she was still unable to find a job just due to the fact that nobody wanted to hire a woman, and the fact that they always came up with excuses. It appeared that women were too emotional to be lawyers, and that if a woman was already hired last year, what in the world would they want with two of them? Eventually, Ruth does find a job as being a professor at Rutgers Law School, which is also known as Rutgers University, and therefore she was teaching the class called Sex Discrimination in the Law. And around the 1970s, this finally fast forwards a little bit, a few years later, Martin, her husband, actually brings a case to her attention, and it was dealing with tax law, as her husband is a tax attorney. This man named Charles Marowitz was from Denver, and he had to hire a nurse to help take care of his mother, who was obviously, her health was declining, but he needed to continue to work. He was denied a tax deduction for having a nursing care because at the time there was a Internal Revenue Code that limited the deduction to a woman, a widower, divorcee, or a husband whose wife had been institutionalized or is just ill in general. And then afterwards, the court had decided that since he had never married, he didn't qualify for the tax deduction. Well, Ruth finally sees this as an opportunity, kind of like a stepping stone, if you will, to challenge all of the other sex-based discriminatory laws that had been taking place over the years, and where it assumes that men will work to provide for family, and the women obviously staying home and taking care of the kids and the husband as well. And therefore, Ruth also sees it as where if she can set a precedent that shows that a man was unfairly discriminated against just because of the basis of sex, of him being a male, then she thinks that it could also be cited in other future cases by challenging laws that also discriminate against women. And she thinks that because of the appellate court, which was in the 10th district, which was composed of entirely of male judges, that they might find it easier to identify with a male appellant because of the fact that he had been unfairly discriminated against just because of the basis of sex. And then therefore she goes to meet this guy named Mel Wolf, and he works for the American Civil Liberties Union, and she wants to enlist the help from him, but he ends up turning her down. And she eventually, in the film, she goes to meet this lady named Dorothy Kenyon, and she doesn't seem very open to the idea, but then eventually she comes around to it once Ruth finally kind of just shows her what she's all about. How Dorothy Kenyon points out that if she wants to change the future, that maybe she needs to look to her daughter's generation, that they're taking it to the streets and they're demanding the change that needs to be taking place. But then Ruth points out that protests are important, but the culture doesn't mean anything if the law never changes. And then Dorothy seems to perk up a little bit. And then she doesn't really let on that she might go to see Mel Wolf at the ACLU, but eventually she meets him at his office, and then she convinces him to sign on to help Ruth fight in the case of Morowitz versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Eventually, it shows that Ruth does go to Denver to meet Morowitz, and he is a little bit reluctant to the idea just because of the fact that he got turned down the first time around. So I'm sure in his head he's probably thinking, what difference would it make the second time around? But eventually he agrees to let the Ginsburgs, which Martin and Ruth and the ACLU represent him, and this was for pro bono, which in legal terms means that they do it for free. And then Ruth finally, she convinces him that millions of other people could potentially benefit from this case, as it could be cited in future cases against sex discrimination laws. Eventually, then there's an aspect where Mel Wolf and the Ginsburgs, they file an appeal to for Morowitz's denial, and they're going to present this in front of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And then eventually the guy, this other justice attorney named James Bozarth, he eventually asks to be the lead counsel for the defense, which would be the Commissioner of Internal Revenue and just the people that turned Morowitz's request down the first time. And he eventually does this big computer search to find all of these sections of the US Code that deal with gender identity. And the defense that he is going to take, that if Section 214 is ruled unconstitutional, that will open the door that challenges all of America's gender-based laws. And then, of course, Ruth, she does poorly when they do this mock court at their house. And then Mel Wolf eventually convinces her to let her husband Martin lead off with the argument of tax law, and then eventually Ruth follows up with equal protection. And that seems to be her best defense. So before they go in front of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, Ruth meets with her old Harvard law professor. They meet at his office, and then they find out that the government is going to offer her client, Morowitz, the settlement of only $1, but then Ruth ends up making a counter proposal where the government is going to pay Morowitz the sum that he claimed as a tax deduction, and make a declaration that he didn't do anything wrong, that he is actually paying his taxes, and also enter into the record that the gender-based portion of this law, which was Section 214, is unconstitutional. And of course, the government turns this down because of the whole idea of the constitutionality element is what it was called. So eventually they say, okay, well then we will see you in court. Which, I mean, that was not a surprise. But eventually, at the oral arguments, like in front of the Court of Appeals, Martin takes a little bit too much more of the time than what he had intended, because the judges kept peppering questions at him. And Ruth, she shows that she is nervous, but she ends up making several key points, and she ends up reserving 4 minutes for a rebuttal. And then eventually the Department of Justice attorney, Bozarth, He frames his side's argument as defending the American way of life, which was implying that the Ginsburgs and the ACLU just want this radical change, and that Morowitz is probably just a person who doesn't want to pay his taxes. Well, in her rebuttal, she ends up becoming much more confident. She ends up stating that the roles in society that existed over 100 years ago, or even in the last 20 years, they are no longer applicable. And she doesn't ask the court to change society, but that the law needs to keep up with the social change that's already taking place, because in her words, she says, we're not asking you to change the country because that's already happened without any court's permission. And there was one little segment that really did catch my attention, and it's where the judge objected in saying that the word woman doesn't exist in the Constitution, but then she ends up pointing out that the word freedom doesn't appear either. And then outside the courthouse of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, the judgment being reserved, the Ginsburgs, Morowitz, and Mel Wolf, they celebrate that the fact that even if they win or they lose, that Ruth has finally found her voice as a lawyer, which she's always wanted to be, but she's always been discriminated against, and she was never given the opportunity to prove that she is worth her weight, if you will. And then in the closing scene, you see that there's titles being shown that the Ginsburgs did win the Court of Appeals, the case. She found that they ended up voting unanimously in Morowitz's favor. So therefore, he ended up getting the tax sum that he had claimed on his taxes. And then Ruth ended up going on to co-found the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, which eventually struck down many gender-based discrimination laws that Bozarth identified. And in 1993, the Senate ended up voting for her 96-3 to become an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And then eventually the final scene shows where Ruth is walking up the steps to the Supreme Court building. But then at the end, you see the real life Ruth Bader Ginsburg walking up the steps at the end, and you see her walking into the Supreme Court building. And it was a very neat perspective to see that overall.
Now that we got a little history lesson out of the way and just an overview of the movie in general, now we can just move on and say, great. I didn't really care for the factual challenging areas that are found within the movie. The reason why I say that I didn't care for the challenges, like that where it's factually based, is because while doing the research for this video essay, I did find some discrepancies, and then we're gonna just go through this list. And I had a fact-checking sheet that I had with me. Okay, so we're gonna go through what was actually true. What was true is that, yes, Ruth did actually attend classes for her ailing husband at that point, because obviously she was attending her own classes as well as attending his, because obviously she wanted him to be able to get caught up and to be able to graduate on time, which I think that's understandable for anybody. And then the thing that was also true is that they did have their classmates did take notes for them, which is great, obviously. Once again, I mean, if you can help somebody out, do it. And then it did actually end up starting her passion for working through the night, which once again, that's her working as late up to almost 5 in the morning. Now, even at the age of 85, that's how late she's staying up and working. It's crazy. And eventually, the next thing that I did find that was actually correct, and I have my notes here while we're looking at this. Another thing, the biggest aspect that was also true on the basis of sex, was that Hurton gave her the case, which had Morowitz versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, and that was a case that happened back in October of 1972. And so this made sense because it had a sex discriminatory law. So that's what she used to make her point that, just because if he had been a woman, this he would have actually been granted the tax deduction because, well, if he had been a woman, he would have been given the money, which don't really see how that would make any difference whatsoever, but apparently back then it did. Really weird laws, I swear. And then the other thing that struck me as odd is the fact that her nephew, Daniel Stiepelman, was actually the guy who wrote the screenplay for this film. And he wasn't sure if that's how he wanted it to play out. He wanted to show that she was finding this case on her own, just found it in the first, and this was one of like the very original rough drafts of the screenplay, which thankfully that did not get put in the film because I think I probably would have questioned it even more if that was the case. And then Ruth, I give her a lot of respect for this, is the fact that she told her nephew that your uncle, which is Martin, gave her that case, so he deserves just as much credit for bringing it to her attention as obviously she gets the credit for representing it at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. Okay, now that we've gotten into like the truths, here's some of the falses that I found during my time of like researching this particular subject. It turns out that her daughter Jane, she was seen as this young activist, future young feminist, and the next generation of feminists. It turns out that wasn't always the case. In fact, that actually wasn't the case. It turns out that Jane was not involved in her Ruth's early legal career, in which at the time she had to have been just a young kid. At least I would say in the early midst of like middle school, probably like around like 7th or 8th grade. She didn't look very old in this film at all. She was not involved in her legal career. In it, of course, like I said, she was portrayed that she was an outspoken activist and that she was poring over legal documents to find these discriminatory laws that was based on gender, which I'm consulting my notes here. And eventually, this young woman, which was Jane, or her daughter, was convincing her to stay on the Morowitz case, even though everybody else was telling her that, oh, you should probably just settle because you're not going to get anything out of it. That wasn't true either. In fact, both of them were very opinionated, very strong willed young women at the time, and they were always butting heads because they had differences of opinions. In fact, actually, the person that was probably going to be seen more as an activist was the fact that there was another law student that actually helped put the case together with Ruth. This was in the first draft of the screenplay, which I mean, you know, if you had your law students, especially as a law professor, if they were willing to do this kind of stuff for you, because eventually it's going to affect them later in the future, I don't know. I just, personally, I think it probably would have been better to have a character, another law student, to actually going over these legal documents, because she wanted this young woman to represent the next generation of feminists. But I think that having another student would have been probably much more effective, because once again, it's not just going to affect these if these laws ever came down, it wasn't just going to affect Ruth's daughter, it wasn't just going to affect the next, you know, maybe her daughter or, you know, her children. It was going to affect every female after that, every woman in the next generations that followed them, it was going to affect. I just think it would have been better if they had another student. Eventually, in the end, it does sound like that Jane, her character ended up taking on a duality, like a two characters sort of. So she ended up taking on like some of the plot duties that one of her law students probably would have had in the film, which I'm not sure exactly why they did this. I'm not sure if it's just because they wanted to save maybe like time or money or other resources for that matter. It's unclear at that point, but I guess, I mean, eventually the point really being is just that Ruth wanted to have it being portrayed as the next generation of a feminist. And then the next false that I found was that the lady that I had mentioned, Dorothy Kenyon, who was a social rights, I know that she was an activist and she was also a civil rights, she was very outspoken about that. The thing that was false about it is that Dorothy Kenyon in the movie helped Ginsburg secure the financial backing from the ACLU, which is American Civil Liberties Union. That was actually false because when I looked at the biography of Dorothy Kenyon, by that point in February 11th of 1972, that's when Dorothy Kenyon actually passed away. And then by that point, and it's very unclear if Ruth and Dorothy Kenyon ever actually came across paths with one another, which I'm going to assume that maybe at one point they probably did, but it was never what was portrayed in the film. She didn't ask her advice on how to argue the Morowitz brief that they were going to have with the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, nor did Kenyon actually go to Melvin Wolf, who is a part of the ACLU, to convince him to sign on with the case and just to help secure the financial litigation that the case would actually need in order to proceed forward. Well, obviously that was false. I mean, because by that point, when the case finally went to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, it was already in October of 1972, and then eventually the case, they made the final decision in November on the 22nd of 1972. By this point, Dorothy Kenyon had already passed away in February 11th of 1972. So that part, like, I wasn't sure about, but then I started to read more articles about it, and this one in particular ended up catching my attention. It proved that it was fictionalized, yes, but eventually what Ruth wanted was that she just didn't want people assuming that she was the first person to ever create this kind of area of law, which I understand that to a degree, because obviously at that time, like, it hadn't occurred to anybody that women should be considered equal under the equal protection principle, which is found in Amendment 14 on the Constitution. Glad that I said that right. Gotta give me credit on that one. And then she wanted the moviegoers to know that she actually stood on the shoulders of two women that came before her, which mentions of Dorothy Kenyon, once again, because we already discussed her. And then there was another gal named Polly Murray, which she ended up putting them, the two women, Kenyon and Murray, as co-authors on the Morowitz brief that she ended up writing, and then before obviously sending it to the ACLU, which eventually I'm going to assume that they end up sending that to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. But the thing that I found kind of odd is the fact that there was no mention of Polly Murray at all in this film. And I'm not, like I said, I'm just not sure if it was just because of due to time constraints or due to the fact that, once again, it probably would have added more money to their budget that they would have had to use to find an actor to play Polly Murray, or like time, resources. I'm not 100% sure why they didn't have somebody portray Polly Murray, especially if these were people that she obviously admired and she obviously took influence from. But it was neat to see, though, that regardless whether there was a Polly Murray in the film or not, she still used them as a co-author on her brief, as well as Kenyon, just to kind of in a way to like to pay her homage to these people, because it just shows that she had the utmost respect for these two women in general. And because Polly Murray was actually a black woman, so she in a way kind of played the whole racial discrimination as well as playing into gender discrimination, because once again she was a black woman. And then it just makes it even better with the whole racial and gender discrimination. But unfortunately, that's how it was back in the 1970s. And it didn't get any better until finally some of these laws were eventually struck down. So another false that I found was that it said Ruth Bader Ginsburg wins the case during the rebuttal, which was the Morowitz versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue case at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. That was false because of the fact that even though, like, her and her husband, they split their time equally because he was the tax attorney, so it made sense for him to obviously argue the tax portion of the law, and then eventually she ended up arguing the gender based discrimination part of it. It split their time equally, so that made sense. And it was true that the judges allowed her to go past her allotted time for this rebuttal, because they wanted to hear what she had to say. But there was one aspect of that said that she froze during her rebuttal. That actually was not true, because Ruth actually even attested to it herself, saying that I did not freeze at all. Like, she spoke probably just like any normal attorney or any normal lawyer probably would speak to somebody, especially if she's been teaching this class at Rutgers Law School. It makes sense that she would have these good speaking skills up to this point. Then there wasn't a rebuttal given. She did not give one. In fact, if anything, that the rebuttal that she did give, if there wasn't obviously a rebuttal as portrayed in the film. She obviously just did her key points in her, set her argument up much earlier in the case that was up there at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And the thing that is actually also true, so I guess there's like half truths in that. Her husband was actually getting peppered with a lot of questions from all three of the judges. And that was actually true when she was supposed to take her turn. That actually happened, but she didn't give a rebuttal, where she just froze and she was just kind of like looking all over at the murals on the walls, at this this court of appeals, just this courtroom in general. Yeah, that didn't happen. Nope, didn't happen at all. And the arguments that she gave were actually close to the form. The Stiepleman was taken from briefs and her conversations that they had together. That was those were her arguments. Like, she must have said them much earlier in the process than what it was said in the film. But other than that, there wasn't a lot of things wrong with the movie, other than just some of the stuff, like some timeline bits were just a little off, and I think that's what like the movie obviously got wrong, and it was just some timeline based things and some character portrayals that just didn't seem very correct. The other thing, like error, people looked at it as an error, and this was their words, this is not mine. There was a glaring error, and this was one of the articles that I had used for one of my sources for this video essay, and it said that there was a glaring error in the movie trailer of On the Basis of Sex, where one of the Circuit Court of Appeal judges stated that the word woman is not mentioned once in the U.S. Constitution. And then Ruth gives her remark saying, nor does the word freedom, Your Honor. Well, anybody who has any kind of legal experience is obviously going to pay attention to that. I mean, that's a given. They immediately said, but wait a minute, obviously there is the word freedom. I mean, it's right there in the First Amendment. Anybody who has paid attention in history class is going to see that there is, once again, there it is, right there in the First Amendment. However, that was actually done on purpose, if you want to say on purpose. The reason for it is that even though there was confusion over that, the First Amendment, where the word freedom was found in the First Amendment, she was citing the text of the Constitution as ratified without the Bill of Rights, because apparently without the Bill of Rights there would be no such thing as freedom in the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution. And the word freedom in the First Amendment isn't a flaw. It was like the point that she was trying to build towards. And she had written one time, and this was her words, quote, is a prime part of history of our Constitution is the story of the extension of constitutional rights and protections to people that were once ignored or excluded. And then she goes on to note that the Constitution as ratified was missing some critical safeguards, which included the broad term freedom, because that's a very broad term, and that was guaranteed by the First Amendment. And since then, the country obviously found value in that term, freedom, and especially by ratifying the Bill of Rights, these judges must now extend true freedom to women, by ending government-sponsored sex discrimination. And those were her words, of course. Um, I mean, very, very powerful words in general. Once again, I was just like, wow, it's amazing. Just this one woman was able to take on, she represented 6 sex based discrimination cases at the Supreme Court, and she only won 5 out of the 6, which, I mean, it's better than nothing. That's a heck of a lot better than what some people would think that might happen. But the one thing that I wanted also saw too, because I was just like, okay, I get that they argued this one case, but then I kind of, you know how you get that feeling in your gut that why do I feel like something's not right here? And then it turns out that the Morowitz versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue was not the first case to set the precedent that would end up taking down the Section 214 of that would make it unconstitutional. Or there was actually another case like back in 1971 called Reed versus Reed, and apparently that's something that Ginsburg was actually a part of. But Reed versus Reed, it was where a man and a woman, Sally and Cecil Reed, they were a separated couple, but they had an adopted child, but then the child ended up dying. And then eventually they had to figure out who was going to be the administrator over the estate. Well, apparently this is where it got really nasty. Yeah, cool. Not so much. No. So apparently, Idaho probate code ended up stating in this thing, and that the males are preferred to females for being administrators over estates, which eventually, obviously, when it came time to figure out who was going to be an administrator, well, who do you think they went with? It definitely wasn't Sally. No, it wasn't Sally. No, good try though. They ended up going with Cecil Reed, but then eventually she ended up challenging that law in court, and it was under the Due Process Clause, and there was also the Equal Protection Guarantee, which found in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And then eventually, that's the case that got represented in October of 1971, and then they ended up making the decision on November 22nd of 1971, and they ruled in favor of Sally Reed, as they saw that it was unconstitutional because it was based solely on sex, like on the gender of her, just because she was a woman, in which, I mean, to me, there was no grounds for that by any means, but I don't know. I think I would just want to say that the creator of the film just wanted to show that this was one of the cases, that the biggest case, which was the Morowitz versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, that was her case. But then again, she obviously made good arguments for the Reed versus Reed case of 71. But I kind of thought that was a little odd, because when one of the parts in the film was that Morowitz, she quoted that he could topple the whole damn system of discrimination. Well, that's where, once again, that's another factually based error right there, is that the Morowitz versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue was not the first one to set the precedent. It was Reed versus Reed of 1971. So that was, that was another discrepancy that I had found. But otherwise, I really thought it was a good film. I really enjoyed it, and I think that I think a lot of people could actually get a good overall view of it, especially probably more like women, because it is about a Supreme Court justice judge who had to overcome adversity herself, and especially in her fight for equal rights, because at the end of the day, these cases not only helped women, but they end up helping men too. If you think that only just the apparently like the fairer sex is in trouble. Well, I think men can be in just as much trouble, and they can just have just as much discrimination put against them as women. And this was definitely portrayed throughout the entire film, that women were definitely discriminated against because, well, they're a woman. But anyway, those are my thoughts, and I hope that you enjoyed my video essay, and I look forward to hearing any feedback from you anytime soon. Thank you.